Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics, and Keir Starmer was back for Prime Minister's questions again yesterday. So I'm going to be going over the 6 questions that the Leader of the Opposition had, along with the 2 questions that Ian Blackford, Leader of the SNP, the second largest opposition party in Westminster, had as well. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So this was a rather different one. It was back to the good old days. I say good old days as if they'd sort of gone, but it was certainly one where Boris Johnson was not able to give a real answer to any of the questions asked of either Starmer or of Blackford. But there was a very different focus in some of the questions from Keir Starmer himself, which I found so interesting that I didn't want to distract from this video. So I'm going to do another video a bit later today where I go over that as well. But first question from Starmer is he quoted he talked about the Prime Minister. We did quote the Prime Minister actually from 3 months ago. I think he said 3 months ago today, when the Prime Minister said that test and trace can be a real game changer for us. So remember, we did use test and trace right at the start of the crisis and it was working. Then we abandoned it for that herd immunity nonsense, and then we couldn't put it back in because the capacity wasn't there, because we'd let things get out of hand. So we had to then build it back up. So when it was ready to come out again, the Prime Minister was announcing it as this great new thing. So Keir Starmer, quoted Boris Johnson saying, this could be a real game changer for us. Then he quoted the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, saying that, finding out where the positive people are, the COVID, infected people are, is the single most important thing that we can do to stop the spread of the virus. Then Starmer pointed out that the day before, the Prime Minister was saying the complete opposite. He said that test and tracing has very little or nothing to do with the spread or transmission of the disease. Starmer said both positions cannot be right. Which is it? A classic one. This is one that Starmer has asked this sort of question before, where he said, look, it's got to be this position or this position. These are mutually exclusive. Can only be one of them. Which is it? To which Boris Johnson didn't answer either, of course. First of all, I'm going to quote the first few words of his answer, if we can call it that. He didn't answer it. His statement, shall we say. He started off with the words, "It is an obvious fact of biology and epidemiology." Now, I would have to stop him right there, I'm afraid. You're not going to get an answer when a politician says that. An obvious fact of biology and epidemiology. Who and in what context could anyone ever use that collection of words? It is an obvious fact of biology and epidemiology. Surely only at a conference of epidemiologists. Surely only then. Neither biology nor specifically epidemiology is obvious to anyone. That is why they are specialised scientific areas of study. It's not obvious to the general member of the population. It's not obvious to the Prime Minister, who has no scientific education whatsoever. Absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, what he was trying to say is, look, Starmer, mate, you've got to understand, the virus spreads by air droplets, right? That's, and of course, it has nothing to do with how modern medicine works. We can't help that, can we? Then he rambled on about how having this system, this test and trace, allows us to see where the infections are in granular levels of detail. To which I would have thought, okay then, so why can't we get people to isolate? Why is it going up if we know where all these people are? If we know where all these infected people are, why is the infection rate going up? But anyway, that's not what he said. What he did say is, this blew me apart, because I thought, hang on a minute, I've not seen this before. So what Keir Starmer said, he said, so why did you say that test and trace had very little or nothing to do with the spread or transmission of the disease? Then he sat back down. I thought, there have been times in the past where he's asked a question, not got an answer, and he's asked the question again, because you would do that if it's going to be an important question for the public and the Prime Minister blatantly hasn't answered it. It's absolutely worth using another question to ask it again, just to really nail down that you're not answering it. But when he's done this in the past, he's tended to layer it. He's tended to first of all point out the Prime Minister hasn't actually answered the question. He's waffled on about something else. And then he layers it with something else, or he rephrases the question. He didn't do that. He literally just stood up, said, so why did you say that test and trace has very little or nothing to do with the spread or transmission of the disease, and then just sat back down. No attempt to point out that the question wasn't answered. No attempt to layer, as I say, into another question or anything like that. I've not seen that before. And that is what sort of got me thinking, he's trying something different here. Anyway, Prime Minister stood up and he said, look, he suggested Starmer wasn't listening to the answer. He said, I gave a very clear answer, very, very clear answer. That the transmission takes place via human contact. What test and trace allows us to do is to isolate people with ever greater detail, which we weren't able to do before. To which again I'm thinking, so why is it going up? If we're getting better at this, how come the results are worse? But then he said, this is thanks to everyone working in the NHS, all these people and the armed services. We have the highest testing capacity in Europe, and the Starmer, the leader of the opposition, should pay tribute to their work. To which Starmer then got up and said, look, listen to the answer. That's why I asked the question. And he pointed out the contradiction again in what the Prime Minister had said this week and what he just said now. He said, look, what you said yesterday is now completely different to what you've just told me. And then he reminded the Prime Minister of what he'd said before the Liaison Committee. So after PMQs last week, he attended the Liaison Committee, which is the cross-party group of MPs that holds the Prime Minister to account, asked him questions. And he pointed out that at that meeting, Johnson had said that testing has huge problems. He also said that Dido Harding, who's the director of Test and Trace, said we don't have enough capacity. And then also quoted the Health Secretary saying that fixing the testing problem would take weeks. To which Starmer said, pretending there isn't a problem is part of the problem. At this point, because he hadn't actually started his question really, Johnson muttered, because Starmer started to ask his question, which is about the problem. He says, what is the reason for the problem? To which Johnson muttered, what problem? Which Keir Starmer went, what do you mean, what problem? The problem you acknowledged last week. And he said, is the explanation for this problem that we haven't got enough capacity because nobody expected the rise in demand? That's the Dido Harding defence, he said. Or is it that we've got all the capacity we need, it's just that people are being unreasonable in asking for tests? That's the Hancock defence. Which is it? To which Johnson then stood up and says, I think the continual attacks by the opposition on Dido Harding in particular are unseemly and unjustified. She's done an outstanding job, all her team have, and he said, I'm not denying the anxiety of people who want tests. Again, he uses the words want tests, not needs, wants. Because again, he is using the Hancock defence, which is, we've got loads of tests. The problem is that people keep wanting tests. Obviously, if people want tests, we're going to run out. I mean, for goodness sake. If people would just stop asking for tests, we wouldn't run out. It's a bit like Donald Trump's. If people would stop testing positive, we wouldn't have as many cases. It's literally on that level. But anyways, he said this is all thanks to the efforts of NHS Test and Trace, blah, 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 blah. And he said to address the point, we're going to go up to 500,000 tests per day, and that is the work of Dido Harding and her team. By the way, Prime Minister, news just in. We're not going to be able to get up to 500,000 tests a day because guess what? We're not able to source the material to get that many tests. Oops. And again, this is a point. I mean, there's a few things that, this isn't a criticism of Starmer. I have got a criticism in a moment, but this isn't one of them. But I think what I would have said at this point is, look, the situation is the reason we're having to do so many tests is because we've let the virus get out of control. If we had a much better control of it, like some other countries do, many other countries do, we wouldn't need as many tests. The reason you're banging on about the fact we've got so many tests going on is because we're needing them because it's completely out of control. But anyway, Johnson finished up by saying, again, what we want to hear and what I particularly want to hear is more of the spirit of togetherness. And this is an opportunity, and this is the opportunity given to us by NHS Test and Trace. And like I said, I've said it before and I'll say it again, where I would criticise Starmer on this. If I desperately want him to, like there's some things where he will ask in his way and he won't ask things I would have asked. That's not a criticism as long as he's making his points. What I desperately want Starmer to say, at this point I wanted him desperate to stand up, and this is not the first time he's had this opportunity. And I want him to say, look, I've got no issue with NHS test and trace because they do a marvellous job. The very small number of tests that the NHS are allowed to conduct are handled efficiently and effectively. My problem is with the vast majority of tests which are handled by Serco, the private company with zero experience in public health, who get our public money, much more than the NHS get, to deliver the bulk of tests and keep cocking it up. That's where my problem is. Not NHS test and trace, Serco test and trace. As it was, he got up and he said, look, I mean, he did make a point, he did have a go, but still. He said, as the Prime Minister knows, my complaint is not with the NHS, it's with the government. He says, my wife works for the NHS. My mother worked for the NHS. He got a bit heated. Then he said, my sister works for the NHS. He got a bit heated at this point. Calm down, Tiger. He said, I'm not going to take lectures from the Prime Minister on supporting the NHS. It's like, whoa, he shouted a little bit. Anyway, Prime Minister Keir Starmer then said, look, the Prime Minister says we have the capacity. He goes on and on about the capacity. So, OK, let us test that. 3 weeks ago, millions of children went back to school. That's a good thing, he said. He said, then the inevitable happened. Kids get coughs, bugs, flu. That's what happens. It's in the job description. But then there's no effective system to deal with it. Many can't get tests quickly. There's only 10 tests sent to school, so that gets used up straight away. Test results come back very slowly. The result is obvious. That means you've got children and siblings off school, mum, dad or carer off work, and in some case, an entire year group off school, which happened to the school down the road, by the way. One teacher got positive COVID test, whole year group gone. They're all at home. So then Starmer asked the Prime Minister, said, how did we get into this mess? To which then the Prime Minister, he tried to say, well, there's a very low risk of transmission in primary. And then he said secondary school children. This is not true. The research suggests that there is a much lower risk of transmission, not zero, but lower rate of transmission in very young children. That would not apply to the older children in secondary schools. Then he said, look, there's 99.9% of our schools are now back, which of course is not the point, because what he was asked about were pupils, not schools, pupils. So let's say you have a school that's got 1,000 pupils in it, but let's say 900 of them are isolated. Well, the school is technically back. The school is back, but it's only got 10% of its pupils, 10% capacity. But anyway, and Johnson was going, and this is despite all his attempts to sow doubt over the summer. To which Starmer then got up and he doesn't happen very often, but then he asked the question that was sort of burning on my mind, because what I thought to myself is, what we really want to know is how many children are off, not how many schools. And so Starmer got up and he just said, not for the first time someone said this to Johnson, he said, such a poor defence. The point isn't whether the children have got COVID, it's that they have symptoms and are off school. He said the government figures show that 1 in 8 children off school this week. Now, personally, I'd have liked to have seen him ask the Prime Minister if he knew that, how many children are actually off school. But he gave him the figures anyway, I suppose, to save time. And he said, look, this disrupts their education. And it doesn't matter whether it's COVID symptoms or symptoms for something else. That's not the point. If the Prime Minister doesn't see that, then he's really out of touch with families and what they are going through. He said losing control of testing is a major reason why the Prime Minister is losing control of this virus. As a result, he's phasing in health measures. Restrictions that we support, he said. He said we support the measures, but at the same time, he's phasing out economic support. And he said that health measures and economic measures are now dangerously out of sync. The point he's making is every time you announce restrictions, those restrictions hit part of the economy. So what you need to put in its place is some government support for the parts of the economy that are going to be hit. That's not what's happening. He's announcing the restrictions, very knee-jerk way of announcing restrictions. But he's not announcing the economic support in there because there's no follow-through with the thinking. Then Starmer quoted the CBI, the head of the CBI, talking about how the measures announced are going to crush thousands of firms. And they said it's vital that all announcements of restrictions go hand in hand with clarity on the business support to protect jobs. And this is someone who represents major employers, saying that your announcements on restrictions have to go hand in hand with clarity on the business support to protect jobs. So then Starmer asked the Prime Minister, so why wasn't that announced yesterday, along with those restrictions, which obviously now is the day before? So then the Prime Minister just bigged up his economic support via furlough scheme. You know, furlough goes on about the furlough scheme. Yeah, great. People supported that, mate. That was a good thing, you know. And the Conservatives, ironically, were the last ones to cotton on to that. Everyone supported that. There was no party that was not in favour of that. The problem is that he's bigging up a support measure that they're currently closing. If it's so good, why is it ending? You know, he said it was world beating. It wasn't. There were better schemes out there. But to be fair, it was up there with them. It was decent. So I'm not going to quibble too much on that. The point, of course, is that that's in the past. Where's the announcement for the next phase? And for the second time today, quite frankly, Starmer got up and said again exactly what I was thinking. He stood up for his sixth question. This is the one, remember, which no matter what he says, Johnson's just going to get up and grandstand, so he might as well just make a point. And he said, look, I'm not asking about the support put in place in the past. We supported that. I'm asking about the support that's needed now, especially in light of the restrictions announced this week. And he said, this is not theoretical. Yesterday, which is now the day before, 6,000 jobs were lost at Whitbread, a major hospitality employer. And he quoted, again, another string of key organisations, including the CBI and the Chamber of Commerce, as well as trades unions, along with the Governor of the Bank of England, a whole series of organisations that represent workers and employers. Again, you know, 2020 is a marvel of a year in many ways. It has seen trades unions and groups, representing business owners in agreement on so many things. It's quite spectacular against a Conservative government. Wonder of wonders. And he said, look, he quoted these people calling on the Prime Minister to stop and rethink. He quoted the Governor of the Bank of England saying the Prime Minister needs to stop and rethink. He needs to support the businesses that are going to be affected. Don't withdraw furlough. Now, I will say on that one, there is a little interesting little reading between the lines in some media reports, and I think they're going to U-turn on that, you know. It's a little bit of an announcement from Sunak that sounds to me like getting ready for a U-turn, but in a face-saving way. I might have to do that in another video. So what then Starmer said, look, we've been saying this for months. When is the Prime Minister finally going to act? Now, I think this last question, to be honest with you, is because he knows. He will know more than I do, because obviously he's part of that Westminster bubble there. He knows what Tory MPs are saying privately. I think he knows that the government are very, very close to U-turn on the issue. I think they've decided they're going to, and they're just trying to work out what's the best way of doing it to stop it looking like a U-turn. And I think what Starmer is doing here is getting in for the last time, his reminder, because they might announce it before next week. He's just getting it in there in the public that we've been calling for this for months. So if the government do it, well, we said all along. So what he's basically saying is, look, Labour, is emphasising the fact that Labour get the decisions right because they call for things. Eventually, the government follows. They have to follow suit. So he's showing that Labour are actually ahead of the game. They're calling for things, well ahead of the game. They're working it all out. The government are just chasing the tail. To which the Prime Minister got up and, of course, he said, "Oh, indeed, these are tough times," and he banged on about doing his level best to protect jobs. He did quote, and this is where you have to be very careful with what you say. He did quote the Shadow Education Secretary saying, don't waste a good crisis, and then tried to say that Labour are just scoring political points. They're trying to use this crisis to score political points while we're actually dealing with the issues. Be very careful about saying those sort of things. But it was just his usual grandstanding after each sixth question. Didn't actually answer the question. Then Ian Blackford of the SNP went on the same line. It dovetailed very, very nicely. So Ian Blackford of the SNP talked about the announcement of the COVID restrictions. But he says, but there are other threats this October. He says there are 1 million people at risk if furlough ends early. I think that might be downplaying it. He also talked about the costs of a no-deal Brexit, because remember, end of October, isn't just when the furlough scheme ends. It's also when we're going to know what's going to happen, because if we haven't agreed anything by the end of October, it's too late. Or at least it's too late for the end of the transition period. And then he also talked about the leak, which again I shall be talking about in a bit, about the 7,000, Michael Gove's letter talking about 7,000 trucks queuing at Dover for days. And then Blackford pointed out that all of this is the government's own making. None of this isn't COVID. This isn't like a natural phenomenon that they're just handling badly. This is entirely made by this Conservative government. Every aspect of Brexit is the government. And Blackford then said, if these numbers become reality, because he acknowledged that it's I think he acknowledged that it's the realistic worst case scenario, but that is what they are anyway. He said, if these numbers become reality, the Prime Minister is leading us into another winter of discontent. He said the Prime Minister must announce an immediate extension of furlough. And he pointed out that, this power is only within the Westminster government. Nothing the Scottish government can do about it. And this will just draw attention to what I was saying about how he handled it last week. Last week I talked about one question was very good from him, one was very bad, and the bad one was just his tub thumping for his supporters back home. And I said at the time, if you can it doesn't do you any harm to ask a question that gets your supporters cheering, but tie it in with an effective question in its own right. And I think this was that. So what he's doing, on the one hand, he's pushing the furlough thing, potentially for the same reason as Starmer. One, he's genuinely in favour of that. Very genuinely, if Scotland had a level of devolution that meant that they could implement the furlough scheme, their own furlough scheme, no doubt at all that the SNP, Scottish Government, would have done that. Zero doubts about that's genuine. But also, like Starmer, I think he also knows that the government are about to U-turn on it. And he has brought this up before as well. But also, he's playing very clever party politics, because it's the best stick to beat Johnson with, because the SNP can do nothing about furlough. They can call for it, they can't implement it. Whereas a lot of the other Boris Johnson response to COVID, like testing, for example, you can also hold a mirror up to the Scottish government and go, well, you're doing better, no question about that, you're doing better, but you've cocked that up and you've cocked that up and, oh, you lied about that. Whereas the furlough scheme, so it was a good question, but it was also a good question that placed your supporters as well. So that's the ideal sort of one. And the Prime Minister, again, didn't answer it. And he said he notices that Ian Blackford and Keir Starmer now support an indefinite extension to the furlough scheme. I could see on the cameras as well, both of them were shaking their heads at this point. Obviously, Starmer doesn't get a comeback. Ian Blackford does. And he said, what we will do is to put our arms around this country. Please don't, Boris. We don't know where you've been. We're sick enough as it is. And he says, we'll come up with the appropriate creative and imaginative schemes. Now, that's not the first time he's used that phrase when talking about, economic support. Creative and imaginative schemes. I'm not really sure in this context what the practical difference is between creative and imaginative. But also, do we want a creative and imaginative scheme? I mean, it can be or it cannot be. It doesn't matter. What surely matters is that it's an effective scheme. Why can't he promise us an effective scheme? That's all we want. Doesn't matter whether it's creative. It could be it could be something copied off another country, which, by the way, I think it's going to be. Rishi Sunak was hinting about German system. But we don't need it to be creative or imaginative. We just need it to work. So then Ian Blackford stood up and echoed what Starmer had to say earlier on. He just said, that is so poor. He says, what we're talking about is protecting jobs today. And then he got a little bit heated. But to be fair, Blackford does that sometimes. And he said, it's not indefinite. And nobody, Prime Minister, nobody has asked for that. He said, the first steps to any recovery is admitting that there is a problem. And then, as with Starmer, he quoted the Governor of the Bank of England telling the Prime Minister to stop and rethink his strategy. He said the solutions for millions of people right now is an extension. He says the alternative is 61,000 jobs in Scotland at risk. And he noted that yesterday all the Prime Minister could do was say he was going to put his arms around them. He says, Prime Minister, I'm telling you, the last thing those 61,000 Scots want is a hug from you. He says they need security on their incomes. Time is running out. Will the government instruct the Chancellor to extend the scheme? To which Johnson just got up and well, first of all, he said, the only thing of note he said was the furlough scheme was already being extended until the end of October. No, it's not. Extended is when you add on an extra bit to it. It was always ending at the end of October. That's not an extension. That's when it's naturally running out. An extension is where you add extra time onto it. So it's not. That was just a lie. The rest of it was bumbling on about funding. No answer again to that. But again, you know, that's one of those questions you wouldn't expect an answer. Again, Blackford's asking it he's asking it for two reasons. First of all, he's making the point. He's asking them to do something. Obviously, you can't say to the Scottish government, well, why don't you do it? Because they can't do that. And also, as I say, I just get the impression, just reading a few little media reports, that the government are getting ready to extend it, but by a different name, so that it doesn't look like they're extending it. They're just coming with I think that's where the creative and imaginative process comes in. They're basically going to get rid of furlough and they're going to replace it with something that's furlough, targeted furlough, which is all anyone's asking for. Labour aren't just asking them to spread. They're asking for targeted. SNP are asking for targeted as well. They'll just say it's not like furlough, it's completely different, but it will still protect jobs. I think that's what they're looking to do. Extend the furlough process, but call it something different. You know, rebrand it. So that it doesn't look like they've just done what the opposition parties told them to do. But anyway, those are my thoughts on PMQs. A bit later, I'm going to go in a bit more detail about some of the unusual questions or styles of questions that I thought Starmer was asking, because I thought that was interesting. But until then, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.